the problem that they never did solve, folk. And this is a problem that mankind has never solved and maybe never, well, the American Indians did to some extent, the problem of the gap between rich and poor. The communists say we don't want to have any rich, we want everybody to be equally rich. Like I say, the only people who have achieved that have been the really, really primitive societies like the American Indians, who had a communistic system where everybody lived in villages, and they could never get united any bigger than a small tribe. And they wound up being overran and conquered by Europeans. And otherwise, people who have anything that can be called a civilization, some people advance more than others. Some people make more than others. Some people are more productive than others. And this is something that communism has a difficult time dealing with. China, the Chinese people will tell you that they have too many people, and they try to limit their population. Now, Chairman Mao did what the communist leaders had done before. He tried to encourage women to have children and bring forth more children. But since 1970, the government of China has launched a stringent family program where that they say that no couple can have more than one child. One child per family. By the early 1980s, the population was somewhat drastically reduced. It didn't work in the countryside, though, where that in the countryside, the farmers wanted to make sure they had more children because they said when we get old. In other words, telling a Chinese farmer to limit his family to one child is like telling one of us, an American man and woman, to burn your Social Security card. Their Social Security was in the number of children they had. The more children they had, the more likely they would have someone to support them as they got older. So they just had that incentive to have all the children. Now your book doesn't say that, not here, it does elsewhere, that when if the child that the couple had was a girl, they would often kill the girl baby and keep having children that had a boy because they wanted a boy to carry on the family name. And somehow folk, they didn't seem to realize that they didn't bring forth girls who aren't going to carry on the family name anyway. But just fundamental biology. So they wound up having a generation of Chinese where they had something like 2 or 3 men to every woman. And that way a lot of your Chinese men then could not find wives. Have any of you heard of this outside the class? Okay, yeah, several of you nodding your head. Yeah, this was a big problem that they had. Again, women were not looked on as being as important as the men were. Now, something your book does say elsewhere, it doesn't say here, the Chinese government did outlaw the practice of foot binding. The authors say that as recently as 1980, they saw some of the older women who had it, and of course some of these laws had a difficult time being enforced in the farthest reaches. I mean, China has areas that are difficult to access and remote. The practice of foot binding was outlawed by the communists in 1949. Until today, you hardly see a Chinese woman, unless she's really old, but you hardly see a Chinese woman anymore who has bound feet. Today, China has the second largest economy in the world, and I'm looking right at page 813. The largest, of course, is still the United States, but I don't know for how much longer. And I think most of you know, if you go to Walmart, which is the biggest department store chain in the country, most of the goods you'll find at Walmart were made in China. And folk, Well, I'll tell you on a personal note, I dabble in electronics. I'm a ham radio operator. And if I want to get parts really cheap, I can order them from China. A radio antenna that would cost 50 or 60 bucks here in the United States, I can get for $11 in China. A $30 transistor I can get for $3 or $4. I have to wait for maybe a couple of weeks. Man, did any of you know what I'm talking about? The Chinese stuff. I mean, even, yeah, well, I recently bought a two-way radio that I believe would have cost me $300 in the United States. I paid $35 for it. Now, it's a little bit flaky, but it's a very popular radio among hams because the hams like it because, I mean, they know its limitations, but then again, when you only pay 35 bucks for it, I mean, what's it to lose? So it's sometimes distorts. Some, you know, mostly it works, but occasionally it distorts or occasionally it does not transmit when you hit the transmit button. A few little problems it has, but again, it was worth the 35 bucks I paid for it. And a lot of the other hams apparently think so also. They have a large economy. They also have an adequate space program that might eventually overtake the United States. The United States space program is lagged so far back that to get our men into orbit and our women astronauts into orbit, we have to carry them piggyback on a Russian spacecraft and pay the Russians $80 million for every person that goes on board. And that $80 million goes to the hiring of better engineers for the Russians, not us. You know, we pay the Russians $80 million. They take us to the space station, which is the International Space Station, not owned by any country, but been put together by various countries. And we have no way to put a man into space right now. Now, we're working on a rocket that should be available in about 2 years that might carry men into space. But for the moment, the Chinese are running a moon race, and folk, for all I know, they'll beat us back. Something else, your book, they do have some labor unrest. I don't see where your book talks about. Oh yeah, environment. Okay, down here at the bottom, page 813. They have over-farmed a lot of their land. And while they have a less population now than they did in 1950, 1/3 of the land that they could use in 1950 is now unusable. In other words, can't be, is not arable. The word, your book uses the word arable, can't be farmed. And a lot of people are afraid that China will not be able to feed its population because, again, their farmland is being destroyed. They've had a bad impact on the environment. Now, my wife and both of my daughters went to China on separate trips, and they can tell you the pollution in China is extremely bad. To the point where you go to the big cities and you have to wear masks to breathe the air. Again, what's the reason? They don't have our pollution control devices. Now I'll tell you, I mean, when I worked at Lockheed, when they started spray painting, the spray paint was only allowed to be done in certain rooms, and before that paint went outside, it went through several layers of filter that included charcoal filtration and other kind of filtration, to where by the time that air got outside, all the paint was left inside, and the air that went back out was paint-free. Again, Lockheed got some awards for being a pollution-free factory. Yeah, they had furnaces, but all the furnaces were told they had to put out clean air. In China, their furnaces put out smoke just like ours did 50, 60 years ago. And again, their air is so bad, so bad you can't breathe it. Folk, it's been about 50, 60 years ago, 70 years ago, you could walk down the city of Atlanta and you could hardly breathe the air in Atlanta because of the automobiles putting out their exhaust. Now today, we have about 6 or 8 times more cars we had then, and the air is somewhat clean. Why? We have pollution control devices in our cars. Now, I've had people, I worked at Lockheed next to me and said, I don't like the idea of having our emissions check done. I said, I do, because I went to Mexico once, I went to Jamaica once, and both of those countries have much fewer cars than we do. You go to the big cities, and you can't breathe the air, or barely breathe the air, because of the smelly pollution. Go to our big cities where we have automobiles all over the place. the air is more breathable. Again, we have installed pollution control device on our airs that guarantee that our cars will put out cleaner emissions than cars once did. Air pollution, as your book says, is 10 times the level in the United States, and it's creating really growing health concerns. And then they add 700,000 new cars to their economy every year. They're trying to work for high-speed bullet trains that connect all the major regions. You know, the bullet train is a train that can go on a rail 300 or so miles an hour and can get you to one place, somewhat like our MARTA, except much, much longer. I mean, I rode MARTA just Friday, 3 days ago, and hey, it's great because it can get you, there's no red lights, no stop signs, no crossroads. It goes underground part way, above ground other part of the way, but it can get you from one place in Atlanta to another pretty fast. The Chinese are doing the same thing. And they're hoping that people will use the rail cars and stop some of the pollution. As it is, though, the pollution is still bad. Oh yes, and I recently heard, since this book, in fact I heard it about a month ago, 10% of the pollution in Los Angeles is now known to come from China. That pollution comes all the way across the Pacific Ocean and lands here. And just like during the Japanese earthquake of 2011, it took 3 years, but a lot of the ships that were in Japan broke loose and started drifting, and a whole lot of garbage and a whole lot of debris started drifting from the earthquake. And the tidal wave washed a whole lot of stuff in the ocean. And after 3 years, some of that debris started finding its way to our cities in Washington and Oregon. They had a ship that was loose, and our Navy went in and used its torpedoes to blast the ship to pieces and send it underwater. There was a ship that nobody wanted. It was rusted down, but it broke loose from its moorings during the tidal wave. China, they have, again, some of their pollution is starting to reach the United States. Now, of course, between us and Los Angeles is Rocky Mountains, and it's difficult for polluted air to get over the Rocky Mountains. But who knows, their pollution might wind up affecting us here in Atlanta. Your book goes on to talk about women and the family. In general, women are more independent today than they were. Your book talks about, though, how that at one time in communism, children were expected to tell on their parents, wives were expected to tell on their parents. Anytime you heard anybody say anything at all against the government, to tell. And folk, it's difficult to imagine living in a country like this. I mean, I'm the father of 3 children, but you go home and make some remark about your government, the next thing you know, the police are knocking your door to carry you away. One of your children, you never know which one, has told on you. Or someone in your family heard you, and they reported you. And actually, you didn't have to say anything. All they had to do was tell that you did say something, and you're arrested and carted off to jail. Again, this is communism for you. Buddhism is making a comeback in China as the Chinese become more tolerant religions. Christianity is becoming more popular now. I want to say this, what I know about Christianity in China. During the time the communists ruled in the Mao, Christians were persecuted, Christians were hauled off to jail and forced to work in labor camps, and many of them died. Your book will tell you that this does not go on anymore. And I talked to some Chinese students who say, oh no, we used to do this, but this doesn't go on, where Christians are no longer persecuted in China. I have heard some stories of secret underground persecutions in some parts of China, persecution of Christians. Your book will make it sound like, though, that that's a thing in the past, that yes, they once did. But I've heard that it's still going on. Taoist, your book calls them Taoist. Taoist or Taoist temples are coming up. Christianity is often viewed as a symbol of success and cosmopolitanism, and that makes Christianity popular in China also. Your book talks about killing female infants just because they're females, mistreatment of females, arranged marriages, still goes on. Your book actually admits that the practice of killing female babies has returned. Arranged marriages is coming back into style. The people are becoming materialistic again. The expensive weddings are now being common. Bribery, favoritism, frequent. Sex crimes, prostitution, all appears to be on the rise. The government tries to combat it, but it's still a problem in China. All right. I'm going to we'll go back to the end of the chapter, page 818, where it tells you why that they think Confucius had appealed to Chinese. Essentially, a lot of it has to do with obedience to the government, obedience to authority, obedience, but not obedience to parents. Confucius taught obedience to parents. The Chinese taught obedience only to the state, and even kill your parents if your parents get in the way of communism. But again, in places where Confucius had his biggest hold, I'm thinking of three countries: China, North Korea, and Vietnam. All three countries have gone communistic. It's almost like Confucius, without realizing it, 2,300 years ago, paved the way for 20th and 21st century followers of his to fall under the yoke of communism. Again, without him meaning to.